Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the PCI Practical Matters podcast, keeping up to date on government contracts issues. Today, we're talking about grant awards to commercial entities, and our hosts are Ryan Roberts and Chad Braley. Take it away, guys.
Thanks, Fritz, and thanks for having us on the podcast. We're very excited to be here. My name is Ryan Roberts. I'm a partner in the government contracts group at Shepherd Mullen, and I'm the leader of our commercial products and services team, which I guess makes me at least marginally qualified to be here and chat about this topic of grant awards to commercial entities. Very excited to be joined here by my old pal, Chad Braley from Capital Edge. Chad, do you want to introduce yourself to the nice folks watching online?
Yeah, absolutely. And Fritz, thanks for having us as well. Ryan, thanks for the invite. Chad Braley, I'm the managing partner at Capital Edge Consulting, which is supporting, like Ryan, a number of federal grantees in the commercial marketplace, comply from our side of the house, right, with the accounting and regulatory and audit requirements of these grants. So excited to be here to talk about this. Obviously, a very expanding marketplace, if you will. Just a few dollars, I think, rolling out. Ryan, you might have some
Just a little bit.
a little bit later. It's almost real money. So looking forward to being here.
Yeah, this is really a topic, at least in our practice at Shepherd. Historically, grants were kind of isolated to our nonprofit clients. These are big entities, right? We have some nonprofits that are in the $1 billion range. These aren't small nonprofits, 3 or 4 folks. So they're real deal government contractors, but grants, cooperative agreements, financial assistance awards, at least in my experience, historically primarily with them. So they were used to them, used to the terms and conditions, because there are some real differences, and we'll get into that, between FAR-based procurements and grants, cooperative agreements, financial assistance awards. Anyway, historically, they were dealing in the grant cooperative agreement space, but now, last 4-ish years, COVID was really the driver here. We've seen a ton of grants, cooperative agreements, financial assistance awards to commercial entities that hadn't received grants before, hadn't performed under grants, and maybe not even performed under FAR-based procurement contracts. So just because of the amount of money that's flowed through in the last 2 to 3 years, we've spent a ton of time with our commercial entity clients, teaching them about grants, cooperative agreements, the uniform guidance, the cost principles within the uniform guidance, the audit requirements, some of the interesting property standards and procurement standards within the uniform guidance. So anyway, Chad and I have done a ton of work together in this space, and I found it to be a fascinating topic. So excited to talk about this for a few minutes here today. And any high-level introductory remarks you want to make, Chad?
No, I mean, I'm with you because there is such a unique opportunity, and to your point, I completely agree. Historically, and same thing, you've got your small not-for-profits, you've got your $750 million a year not-for-profits, you've got very large, but this is the environment that they play in. And now, when we talk about, we want hydrogen hubs, right? And we want, internet infrastructure expansion and all these things, which are, things that companies are pursuing today, right? But they are for-profit entities. So it's a great non-dilutive revenue stream in some ways, right? I'm going to spend this money. We see that all the time in the biotech life sciences. I'm going to do this clinical trial. If I can get some grant funding to offset that, that'd be great, right? Because I'm gonna spend it anyway. The additional compliance pieces that come in, it's like, yeah, that's great. There's $20 million or $100 million, but you have to do all of these things, right? And that's where I think a lot of these large for-profit companies, to your point, just need to understand kind of what they're signing up for, and also how they're going to execute against that, just from a reporting standpoint, because they're just not set up
For sure.
nor do they need to be for their traditional business.
Right. Yeah, and I was shocked, as I started to delve into some of the stats on grant awards versus cooperative agreements and FAR-based procurement contracts, just how much the federal government spends on grants year over year. So historically, much to my surprise, the federal government has spent more on grants than FAR-based contracts. You think about the context a little more, it makes sense, but since at least FY 2018, that's just as far back as I did my USA spending research, grant awards have been significantly higher than federal contracts year over year. And for the last 3 years, we're looking at around or over $1 trillion in grant awards annually. So we're talking about huge, huge sums of money. But the change that we've seen post-COVID is the recipients of those awards, right? A lot of that money going to commercial entities. And to your point, Chad, I've kind of seen it in two flavors. So one, we're going to do this anyway. We'd love to take some federal money to help us along with that process. The second flavor is we had no intention of doing this. This wasn't a profitable project for us to do. We weren't going to go into this space. We weren't going to build this manufacturing capability. We weren't going to extend this broadband infrastructure to this area because there wasn't a business case to do so. Now, when you get millions, tens of millions, billions of dollars to factor into that business equation, it makes a little bit more sense to stand up that new manufacturing facility to extend that broadband infrastructure. So I think the business reality here is just that the math has changed. And that's why we're seeing a lot of our commercial clients kind of get into this grant space for the first time, because $1 billion every year is a lot of money, right? So if you're going to get that to help your project along, it's going to help out. Just real quickly on the appropriations legislation, I know we've talked about that $1 trillion of money in the last couple of years. Where is that actually coming from? The two big hitters that I've seen in my practice, at least, at IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the 2021 statute, about $550 billion appropriated by Congress just in connection with that statute. Another statute, 2021, ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act, $350 billion there. So combined, you're looking at $900 billion in a single year for all of these projects. So Chad, how have you seen that money make its way to the folks that you work with?
I would say in some instances very quickly, in some instances at a snail's pace.
Yeah.
In terms of actually getting it on award and getting it out there. Obviously, if we think about the broadband infrastructure, I think that's been a pretty competitive marketplace, right? For some, right? In terms of especially others trying to get market share in areas where they might not otherwise. But it's coming, and then where I think a lot of where we're also seeing it is maybe not at that prime recipient right level, but at the subrecipient level, and a lot of organizations in that space that are providing services that may or may not. It's the same thing, right? It doesn't really matter if you're the primary or subrecipient. This stuff is still flowing down. Then obviously we have kind of the conundrum, if you will, when it's coming through the states. Is the states are throwing different things in there, and it's like, okay, which one are we going to follow here? And so there's been, I think, a lot of confusion in a lot of these, and a lot of lack of clarity in some of the agreements, especially what I've seen. I don't know about you, Ryan, but as with the broadband infrastructure is you get into the actual kind of construction element of it, and compliance with Davis-Bacon Act and certified payroll reports and reporting and wage determinations and all these different areas. And a lot of that, we've seen a lot of very unclear guidance, right? We know what Davis-Bacon says, but the different states that some of this money is flowing through. I don't know if you heard any of that, Ryan, or if you're back.
Yeah, little go-to meeting technical issue there, but I'm back. I'm alive.
Very good. No, what I was saying is, not only we see it then also challenging at the subrecipient level, but also what we've seen, at least on the broadband infrastructure, is a lot of very unclear. It's like, well, Davis-Bacon's in here, but it doesn't really apply. But it does because the act says it does, and confusion over wage determinations, confusion over locations, and just so I think it's important. It's actually not important. It's critical for the organizations accepting these dollars to really understand what the actual requirements are, because in many cases, the states that they're getting it from, as it flows through from the feds, they don't know.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of that guidance, I think, is like, oh, don't worry about that until the Department of Labor shows up, and then it's like, well, I should have worried about that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I want to get into the grant compliance basics, but just in case anyone is wondering, like, hey, what are you talking about, $1 trillion? I haven't seen any of this money. Where is this money actually going? What type of programs are we funding here? Just a couple of examples. Broadband infrastructure, a great one. I think it's $52.5 billion across 2 different programs to fund broadband infrastructure development. But we're seeing a lot in the energy space. So EV charging station, renewables projects, energy efficient heating, cooling. Defense Production Act supply chain capabilities. So remember back early COVID, huge issues with not having a secure supply chain, lacking specific products that we needed to help combat the public health emergency. So we've seen some spending in that space to increase domestic manufacturing capabilities, kind of tied to that healthcare marketplace, but also in critical defense articles, semiconductors, certain manufacturing capabilities. So and these are all in addition to traditionally where we saw grant money being spent in the for-profit space. So construction type infrastructure projects, airports, highways, bridges, trains, right? So those historically we saw a lot of money flow through. That hasn't gone away. We're continuing to see real investment there.
It's not going down.
Yeah, just a big picture landscape of where all this money is being spent. But how it's being spent is fascinating here. So one point, just generally speaking, I think we've mentioned this a couple of times, but just to level set for folks. Grants, cooperative agreements, financial assistance award governed by something called the uniform guidance. If you see uniform guidance in a solicitation notice, God forbid we get to the point when you're actually receiving a draft award from your business folks, and the lawyers out there, you see uniform guidance reference or 2 CFR Part 200. Those are the regulations that comprise the uniform guidance. Anyway, that means you're in the grants cooperative agreements world as opposed to a FAR-based procurement contract, right? So that's important. Uniform guidance, grants, FAR, procurement contracts. Some carry over between the two, but I've been shocked at how many commercial entities are sending us draft agreements that cite the uniform guidance. Say, hey, I got this new FAR contract. Can you take a look at it? Like, whoa, let's take a step back here. Just to be clear, your company's about to sign a grant. Are you comfortable with that? Have you seen that too, where folks are just sending you these draft agreements and not even appreciating what it is they're about to sign?
Absolutely, and just the terminology in general. Hey, I got I'm getting a contract. Well, that's a grant. That's
yeah, it's a loaded statement, guys.
Exactly, and and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but the cost reimbursement concept, right,
yeah.
is very different, especially for most commercial entities, because quite honestly, in some ways it's no different than on the contract side, although you can make profit on the contract side. But the fact of cost equaling revenue is not a normal business practice, right? It's like I set price, I cut costs, I make margin, things are good. So that concept has been very different. But yes, the terms and conditions, what's this single audit, or even some that may have taken it early on that we're running into now, that's like they're in, they haven't had a single audit in 2 years, and we're asking where that is. Or so we're seeing it really across the board, and I think to a certain extent, and you've probably seen this as well, some of the agencies are overwhelmed also, right? And so we see this with a lot of our clients' DOE grants and cooperative agreements, like just trying to get some things closed out, things renegotiated, rates established. It's just taking a lot of time because they simply don't have the manpower for the amount of dollars that have come out through over the last few years. And I think the other point that as you're talking about all the acts and all this new money, it's not like all that money going for great research at the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department, U.S. Agency for International Development. That money's still there too.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like that got cut and everything got moved here. But I think the other thing that I don't know, is just more interest to your point. The domestic manufacturing is we all know it's a massive need, right, coming out of the pandemic, and whether it's getting a production line or doing different things, but just understanding what comes with that. And we've actually seen a couple for profits because that kind of got into this unknowingly, right?
Yeah.
Had some issues, and now they're kind of like, I don't know if I want anymore. And it's like, wait, there's still a lot of opportunity here that both sides could benefit from. We just got to get our ducks in a row.
Yeah. Yeah, and so two critical points I think you just made there. So one, the layering of requirements is kind of unique for grant awards, and it depends on the federal awarding agency and how that program is operating. So you mentioned DOE. DOE is making a number of direct awards to, I'm just going to make up an example here, entities that are going to manufacture certain technologies, so energy efficient heating products, heat pumps, that kind of stuff. But that's a direct award from DOE to the entity. So you see, your standard uniform guidance terms and conditions. DOE has a supplement to the uniform guidance, just like DoD, for example, has a supplement to the FAR. So you have FAR, DFARS, uniform guidance, DOE supplement to the uniform guidance. It's more akin to a traditional FAR-based procurement structure than some of these other programs. For example, Commerce and Treasury on the broadband infrastructure point, they are making awards not directly to the commercial entities, but to states, counties, and cities. Those states, counties, and cities are then making awards to the commercial entities. So as a result, you have the congressional mandate in the statute that we want you to spend money to do X, and there'll be some strings attached to that statute. Then you get into the federal agency program specific regulations. So you'll have your Department of Commerce, for example, standard T's and C's. Those T's and C's incorporate the uniform guidance and the agency supplement to the uniform guidance. And then it goes to the state, county, city, and they're going to put their own procurement stuff in the award too. So when you look at, you end up having 4, 5, 6 layers of regulations, and some of which are just incorporated by reference in a single line. So you could have hundreds of pages of regulations just simply incorporated by reference. So that layering of requirements has caught our commercial entities totally off guard. Like, what has been your experience with that, Chad?
I would 100% agree. And not only that, but in many cases, at the specifically at the state level, I think I've seen it more there than maybe the local level. And I say that only because I don't know that we've had as many at the local level, but at the state level, a lot of the guidance seems contradictory to what the overlying federal guidance is, or there's been
Yeah.
direction, well, that doesn't really apply here, but it can't
Yep.
not apply because it's part of the actual federal regulation, right? They can't take that out and trump it, if you will, and just say that that doesn't apply. And then that's catching them more off guard with, then what about my subrecipients, right?
Right.
Or my vendors, right? And which I want to keep them more vendors versus subrecipients if at all possible. So yeah, just a myriad and the same thing. It's like, well, there's some stuff incorporated by reference. It's like, have you Googled what that is? Because it's not a couple additional things.
Right.
It's
Right.
not an additional equal opportunity employment clause. It's that plus
Right.
50 more.
Yeah, totally agree. And a number of these terms incorporate, like, for example, we saw one agreement recently from a state that just, incorporated the entirety of the uniform guidance. We hereby incorporate all of 2 CFR Part 200. In the client. So, well, what does that really mean for us? Anything here I should be worried about? Like, yeah, there are a number of potentially shocking clauses in the uniform guidance that weren't really drafted to apply to commercial entities, but just the way these programs have evolved, how these programs have been funded, like they're going to apply to your award unless we can negotiate some exception to those. So I
Right.
have a couple written down here that I wanted to talk about just because these are clauses that really caught our commercial entities particularly off guard and new to the grant space. And I think the first one is just the limitation on program income. So for anyone who's new to the grant space, there's a standard uniform guidance requirement that essentially says if you make a profit off of the grant program, that profit essentially will offset any costs for which you can seek reimbursement from the federal awarding agency. So if you have a $50 million grant award, but you make $10 million off of whatever you sell from that grant award, you can only seek reimbursement for the $40 million. You don't get that $50 million back. And that's an oversimplification, but that concept has been shocking to our commercial entity clients who thinks this is just a free $50 million to go out and stand up a new manufacturing facility. Has that been a similar experience for you, Chad?
Yeah, not if you're making money off of it, you're not going to get the full amount, and that's kind of the thing. What do you mean I don't get the full amount? Well, you just
Right.
to your you just made this money. So, but is there an opportunity to maybe do more and offset that a little bit? Potentially, right? And it all depends. One of the things, right? Obviously, Ryan, you're the attorney, right? I didn't do anything to stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so I can't opine on legal. But what's been your experience? Because it's not something that we necessarily get involved in as much, right? Because we're not the attorneys in being able to negotiate certain things in and out of these with some of the states. Because I think you've had some success with that with some of your clients, where others are just I don't even think trying to negotiate. They're just saying, well, this is what they said we have to take, and this is what we're going to take. So now
Right.
what do we do? And you know as well as I do all those things that where it says if these don't apply, they'll read themselves out. We know what that means.
Yeah, no, we're not going to deal with that. Now, we've had some success negotiating around some of these requirements, whether that's to get a wholesale waiver of them so they're inapplicable, or just say, for example, program income applies just to the grant period of performance. During that grant period of performance, we're only, for example, standing up a factory. Like any commercial production we get into after standing up that factory is going to occur after the budget period, and therefore is not covered by the program income requirement, for example. Right? So you take the money to stand up the factory, but you segregate out the commercial production activities thereafter, so you don't have to offset your grant award from any, whatever you sell, cars you sell after you actually stand up the facility. So there are some ways around it that, other agencies like Treasury and Commerce, for example, actually went to OMB and sought a waiver of some of the uniform guidance requirements, including program income, to say, ISPs building out broadband infrastructure, you're allowed to make income off of this network that you build using in-part grant funding. So there are a couple different ways on these requirements to deal with them, but you have to be conscious that they're there first, right? You have to go into it eyes wide open and know it's an issue to address.
Exactly, because if you're going to go into, and I'll pick my birth state, the great state of West Virginia, right, which doesn't have a lot of broadband, and I know that there's a lot of money going there, which I think is fantastic. But if you're going to build out a region, you're going to start in that area, and you're going to get this area up and running first, right? So you can start signing people up, right? And so there's going to be an income component. So I think it's great that. There's a willingness to negotiate on some of that with the agencies. But to your point, if you're not aware of that, you're not negotiating that issue, and you may have just, it's I'm sure it's feasible that you could wipe out half of the intended reimbursement
Right.
with program income without a waiver, and getting that waiver after the fact is much less likely than getting it up front.
Yeah. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, and along the same lines, the second clause that I had here that particularly surprised our commercial entity clients, the federal interest provisions of the property standards within the uniform guidance, which, again, simplifying, essentially state that if you buy, for example, equipment using grant funding, the federal government retains an interest in that equipment. So you get kind of constructive title of the equipment during performance, but the federal interest attaches, meaning at the end of the period of performance or the useful life of the equipment, you have to actually go back to the federal agency and seek what are called disposition instructions. And typically those disposition instructions say, okay, pay me back the now fair market value of that equipment you acquired at the end of the budget period. So while we may have given you that $50 million to go and buy the equipment on the front end, now it's worth $35 million and you have to pay us back that money. So, I heard one person recently describe grants as free money to these commercial entities. That is not true at all. Like, there are real strings attached to it. There's a federal interest in ownership of the actual equipment you're buying with the grant funds. So again, it's one of those things that we can deal with on the front end, but it has to be part of the business equation, that there is at least a potential here that you as a commercial entity are going to have to repay some of that grant money at the end of performance for the fair market value of that equipment.
Right. And even the dispositioning process is not something, I mean, we've seen those sit and sit and sit. And so you've got these assets that, to your point, that the government has an interest in, and I can't really do anything with it, right? Other than that program, which may have ended. So I'm just kind of storing it and making sure it's protected until somebody decides, what they're going to, how they're going to disposition that. Because, and I'm sure you're seeing it in most cases, the government doesn't want it, right? They're not going to do anything with it, but it's just the paperwork and the process, which can also limit the use of said asset for a while, until that, especially for use on other programs, until it's taken care of.
No, exactly. And most of the federal agencies or programs require that liens be attached to them, right? So the federal interest is clear that the property is encumbered and you can't sell that property during performance unless you get the federal awarding agency's permission to do so. So like to your point, that equipment can sit for a long time if the federal awarding agency isn't playing nice and helping you, move along that process. Another point here, and you've hit on this a couple times already, a number of our clients haven't appreciated that grants historically and typically are cost reimbursement awards. So I'm going to play the dummy here, Chad. I'm going to be somebody new to cost reimbursement contracting. I have huge commercial business, but I've never done a cost reimbursement federal contract, federal grant. Like, what are the basics? What do I need to know? This is all new to me. Teach me, teach me.
All right. So this is going to be a 2-day podcast. So here we go. Gosh, I mean, just the basics, right? Project cost accounting, right? That's really what it is, project cost accounting. And when we think about it, and does it in so much of what we're doing, right? What is that main driver of cost? It's labor. Yes, it's equipment in some cases, or materials in some cases, especially, if we're building out a factory, building a new factory, expanding, from adding a production line to an existing facility. But there's people doing work, and
Yeah.
capturing that time to that cost objective, because if I can't prove that for this program, right, I spent my $10 million, $20 million, whatever, right, I'm not able to get that. The other challenge, just to make it a little bit more complicated, is some of these may be cost sharing arrangements.
Yeah.
So let's just make it easy math. I'm going to get a $10 million, total value, but it's a 50-50 cost share. So I spend 10, I get reimbursed 5. I've got to prove that I spent the 10 to get the 5. If I can only prove I spent 8, I only get 4. And so it's time and effort reporting. That's a big challenge. It's the basics of a compliant accounting system, similar requirements in uniform guidance, but you could really, I mean, I would say best practice follow, the FAR guidance there, because you're still doing the same basic concepts, right? Identification of vendors and purchases specifically for those awards. Who are my subrecipients under these awards? Subrecipient monitoring, which comes in from the 2 CFR 200, and are they high risk? Are they low risk? Do we have indirect cost rates, right? That's where we see companies leaving a lot of money on the table because the budgets aren't really constructed for full cost absorption, full cost reimbursement. Because to your point, these are commercial entities. We're going to market at price, right? We charge this price for our product. We charge this price for our service. Pick your broadband infrastructure company, right? They invest their own dollars to go in, build out the infrastructure, and then they charge $59.99 a month. And then when your contract expires, they raise it 50%, and they charge you that for the next 12 months, right? Until you call and don't get a person, and all those things. But it's project cost accounting, identifying cost, because if I can't identify the cost, essentially I don't get the revenue. Cost equals
Right.
revenue and cost reimbursement contracting. And then you layer in things like, allowability and reasonableness and things of that nature, from the uniform guidance, and or for-profit companies being subject to the FAR Part 31 cost principles, right, which are very similar. I think uniform guidance I kind of call diet FAR or sugar-free FAR, something of that nature. But it's that the ability to do that in a large commercial entity. So it may require a separate project cost ledger or some configuration within their systems to really be able to specifically identify all of these costs to these cost objectives. And then I think from an indirect perspective, it really comes into play as, how much are you entitled to recover, and how much do you want to support that? Because understanding that it all becomes auditable, right? And so, we see a mix, and specifically with the large commercial for-profit entities, I think there's probably honestly a willingness, and we thank them from a taxpayer perspective, to leave some money on the table because they don't necessarily want to expose that to audit. But that's the business decision that they make. What we oftentimes run into is situations where it's already been agreed to, and they could be recouping, so much more. But it really depends on the business. But I think people lack education of like, I can try to charge that, but I've got to be able to support all the costs behind that and be able to
Yeah.
capture those. And you're sitting in multiple different systems because this group does this and their costs are over there, and this group does this because their costs are over there. It becomes really challenging and daunting from a a large company perspective, because there is some infrastructure build out to support this. Not no pun
Oh yeah.
intended. Internal company infrastructure, right, to be able to support it.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and there's a couple of points there. So on my list of surprising things to commercial entities, Subpart F, the audit requirements, uniform guidance, and the Single Audit Act, one of those that's super surprising. So just be aware, if you're getting in this space, there are real deal audits that occur and real requirements that you need to comply with, and documentation that you need to ensure you're generating during performance to help support those audits down the road. And just general reporting requirements. Every program has their standard reporting requirements, but they do vary program by program. So again, just be aware of what those reporting requirements are and make sure you have the infrastructure necessary before agreeing to the actual award. I know I said grants, cooperative agreements, uniform guidance, totally different than FAR-based contracting, different worlds, totally unrelated. That was a little bit of a lie. Like as Chad just mentioned, there are cost principles in Subpart E of the uniform guidance. Those cost principles explicitly reference FAR Part 31 for for-profit entities. So you do have this world for commercial entities performing grants where FAR Part 31 does apply to the cost principles. And then lastly, my takeaway as someone who doesn't do a ton of cost work, I remember learning back at GW Law when I took my cost accounting class in law school, allowable, allocable, reasonable, right? If you know nothing else about cost reimbursement contracting, those three pillars, we could spend a day on each of them, right? But those are the three pillars that I always keep in mind that govern cost reimbursement contracting. So has to be allocable to a specific project, has to be an allowable cost, and that cost, even if it's allowable, has to be reasonable. So to me, those are just conceptually the pillars that I focus on.
No, those are the pillars, but the to me the even bigger pillar is you can throw all that out the window if I can't identify it to the program in my system, right? And so that is oftentimes the biggest challenge, just because of the cost structures of these organizations. They work, and they don't they care about time and effort reporting simply from a did you show up, how long were you here, and you're gone, now I have payroll, right? I know what to do. But what did you do in those 40 hours? And I worked 20% or 20 of my 40 hours on the grant program, and I did other things for 20 hours. That just that basic infrastructure. And there are some very inexpensive bolt-on timekeeping tools that you can utilize for some of these programs for kind of a quick hit solution, to be cognizant of in the marketplace. But just sometimes that level of basics and that level of reporting, we've seen a lot of people honestly leave the labor on the table, because they don't want to go down the road of actually tracking it, or don't think it's material enough, which again is a business decision. But I would want to get every dollar that I'm entitled to.
Yeah. Yeah, and as we wrap up here, I think you just hit on a couple points too that I just want to leave folks with. So if you're a commercial entity, whether you're on the legal side or the business side, just a couple of the key considerations you all should have in mind, and you're making the decision on, as a business, whether to go forward with a grant award or consider a program, or on the legal side and advising the business. They come to you with this potential opportunity. What should you tell the business folks that they should be thinking about? So the first one, I think we've just spent a ton of time on, the necessary infrastructure, right? Do you have the necessary infrastructure to actually perform this award? And part of that's the recognition that you will need that cost accounting infrastructure. You will need some procurement policies and procedures depending on what you're buying and how you're performing. The property standards, do you have the infrastructure in place to account for the federal interest in the property, for example? So that infrastructure investment, to me, I think is key, and it's one that commercial entities aren't thinking about enough on the front end. As we're advising the law departments on this issue, we're playing a little bit of catch up on the infrastructure piece. Has that been your experience too, Chad, or you really need to make that infrastructure investment?
You do, and I think the one takeaway I would say is I think that in many cases companies assume that infrastructure investment is very daunting, right? Because it's different, and while it's different, it doesn't have to be that daunting, right? And
Right.
it may require just some minor tweaks. And quite honestly, sometimes we get into using the official accounting system of every government contractor or grantee, which is Microsoft Excel. Very
Yeah.
cost-effective product, but being able to tie that back to the records, right? And there's and as you know, there's kind of outsourced solutions for this to kind of help take care of this if companies are interested. But it's not it's not the rocket science that, right, you and I both have clients that actually do rocket science, right? And when they talk, we don't know what they're talking about, but it sounds really good.
Hey, don't give away our secrets. They don't need to know that.
But with this, the infrastructure required, it's made out to be rocket science, and it's really not. So I think don't, that's the biggest thing is there's a ton of opportunity here. Let's not throw our hands up because we might have to do a few things differently for
Yeah.
$50 million. I mean, I think many of us would do a couple things differently for $50 million. I think
Hey, what are you accusing me of here, Chad? I don't like the implication there. No,
I'm not
but,
I do things differently for $50 million.
yeah, but I totally agree. And secondary consideration there, like it may not be a huge investment, but like taking a step back, like do you have any indication from the business, or if you're the business from the contracting shop, that there's some flexibility to negotiate those very unbusiness friendly terms, right? So we talked about the program income limitation, we talked about federal interest, cost accounting requirements. We've had some agencies say standard commercial accounting practices are okay. You actually don't need to comply with the Subpart E cost principles of FAR Part 31. So if there's some ability to negotiate to make it a little bit more business friendly, like that's a big deal, and we should take advantage of that, or at least press the contracting shop on whether we can make this a little bit more tolerable for whatever it is that your business is trying to accomplish. And then the last thing, and this is probably the most critical, so probably not the best thing to end on, but what's the company's goal in taking this grant money? Is it that they really view it as free money to do something that's unprofitable? Is it, to your point on the pharma side earlier, is this something we were going to do anyway, and the federal investment helps us do it a little bit better or expand the scope? Or is this a project that was historically unprofitable and we wouldn't have done it but for this grant funding, right? Those are all very different business analyses. And say you weren't going to do the project but for the grant funding, and it turns out to be an interest-free loan that you have to pay back in 5 to 10 years. Know that now, like factor that into your business decision making now, so that you're not shocked in 10 years when you end up doing the unprofitable project you didn't want to do because you thought the federal government was subsidizing it, right? So to me, and that's one point here that our commercial entities aren't thinking about enough. I think we're retraining them a little bit to think about these grant programs differently. But to me, that has to be a key consideration. One of those gatekeeping exercises. Like, what is our goal here? What do we hope to obtain out of this program?
100% agree. And I think, especially in the manufacturing expansion space, right, domestic production and things like that, for that, I think it's a combination of things, right? Sometimes I don't know that I would spend my own money to do this, but if it's going to be partially subsidized, it becomes very intriguing, right?
Right.
And I think there's others that are simply for, we've had a lot, whether it's life science, biotech, some of the domestic production, where it's been more about this is good for our country
Yeah.
to do this, right? Or we're going to get the benefit of having the availability of this commercial production line, or the government can come in and take it over and we'll make whatever they want, right, based on the terms of the contract for a certain period of time, and we're going to pay for that as well. So it makes a lot of sense. And so, but to your point, I agree. It's not free money, right? Whomever said that, it's not free money. It comes with a lot of hooks, right? And it's kind of like that fish hook in your finger. You probably get it 2 inches in before you get it back out. So you want to be cognizant of that. How does this align with the overall business goals? And quite honestly, we've seen some organizations say, we get it. It's a lot of money. It can be beneficial. It doesn't align with our business goals, and we're not going to
Yeah.
to do that. So I completely agree. And I think the other thing is there seems to be this inherent assumption that a lot of these things are non-negotiable. So I think your point, Ryan, and your ability to help clients that you're working with on the front end, we don't always see that because we're working with clients on the back end, and this is already
Yeah.
happening. And it's almost like, well, this is the government, you can't negotiate with them, and that's completely untrue. But they really need your support up front to be cognizant of that, and understand the levers that certain things you're not getting out of here. Other things are going to be negotiable, and understanding what those are, I think, is absolutely critical.
Yeah, well, thank you for the plug there. Checks in the mail, money's on the way. Don't worry, it'll clear this time. I promise. Well, thank you for joining me today. Always good to catch up with you and talk about interesting topics like this. Thanks to PCI for having us today. Fritz, apologies that we went like double the amount of time, but as you can tell, Chad and I like talking about this stuff and can never shut up. So thank you again for having us, Chad. Good to see you, and thank you, PCI.
Ryan, great to see you. PCI, thank you very much. And Fritz, if you need to cut this in half and do two, that's fine.
This has been the PCI Practical Matters podcast. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.